Hello, everyone. My name is Britt Fulmer. I'm the Director of Curriculum at Coach Training EDU. As part of our ongoing efforts to investigate and integrate the latest research into coaching frameworks, we recently had the special opportunity to sit down with someone on the front lines of that very research. Next, you will see an interview with Amie Gordon. She is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Michigan and the director of the Wellbeing, Health, and Interpersonal Relationships Lab. Research in her lab focuses on the interplay between the social cognition, emotions, and biology that shape our closest relationships. In this interview, we dive into different aspects of interpersonal relationships, including gratitude, stress, and compatibility, and the perspectives on making relationships stronger. So, with that, let's watch the interview.
Where did you get into your research, or what was the pathway to where you are
Yeah.
today?
So I took a fairly direct path when I was so I did my undergrad at UCLA. So I've been at basically large research universities my entire career. And I knew there was something called research and I was, supposed to do it. So I went and looked at the list of options when I was going into my sophomore year. And one of them was the UCLA Marriage and Family Lab. And I was like, wait, you can study that? Like you can research that stuff? And I was a very inquisitive kid who was, the one always asking my parents, why do things work this way? I also was the kid who used to steal my older sister's romance novels. Like I wasn't really supposed to be reading them yet and would be like so fascinated by these, complex relationships, but also like, what's with these idiots? Why don't they just communicate with each other? Why are they like protecting each other, but ultimately like hurting each other? So it was something relationships was something I'd always been interested in. And so when I discovered you could actually make a career out of studying it, I was pretty jazzed. And so I ended up taking a year off and then doing research and going on to get my PhD at Berkeley. And so one of the first things I studied when I started there, sort of figuring out what I wanted to research, was gratitude. And for me, it was sort of the question of, let's say, at least like in the US, even if I get that narrow and say like, when we think about romantic relationships, we spend a lot of time and effort like finding a partner, right? And thinking that like, oh, if I get into this relationship, there's a lot of hope that this person has potential and that we're compatible and all of that. And so my question was, where does that all go so wrong, right? Like, how do we start out with such high hopes and so often end in disaster? Like, what changes, right? It's not like we just date anyone we meet on the street, right? We put a lot of thought and effort into who we end up with. And there's a lot of, and there's whole fields of research on compatibility and all of that. And there's still a lot of mystery to it that we have yet to unpack. But for me, the question I had was, do we start to take our partners for granted? And so, I've been interested in this in the context of romantic relationships. And I find those relationships so interesting because they're sort of ones we select into, but then become often our primary relationship from adolescence through adulthood, with so many pieces to it, right? This is your friend and your business partner and your co-parent and your lover and all. There's just so much. And so it's like, how do we keep those relationships going? And these relationships that often are at, the head of a family that had implications for the children and for other aspects of our lives. And so I'd say what I study translates in many ways to other relationships as well, but that's the relationship I tend to focus on. And so my question was, do we start to take our partners for granted? And do we just habituate? Like early on, you see all the good things and then you get used to it and you stop noticing it. And I call it sort of our unfortunate human tendencies that we adapt to the good things in our life and start to take them for granted. So that was some of the first research I did when I started in my PhD program, was trying to ask the question of, are people who are more appreciative in better relationships? Basically, do they do more to hold on to their relationships? Do they stay in their relationships longer? Do those relationships look different, and in what ways than ones where people aren't as grateful for their partners?
So, it's just fascinating. So I imagine you're in a relationship too. Do you get the thing where people are asking you like, so how is it working like for you personally? Like,
Yeah.
How, yeah.
So I happened to meet a person who's now my husband on my first day of undergrad. First day of college, we met. And so it's been
So awesome.
over 20 years now, more than half of my life. And I use that often if I'm giving talks or when I'm teaching in my psychology of close relationships class, and say, I have been studying this for as long as I've been in this relationship, and I still make mistakes, right? Like, relationships are hard, people are complicated. Sometimes we know the right thing to do and we don't do it. And I can come back to that. That comes up a lot with gratitude. And so using that as a point of, I try to apply everything I learned to myself, but sometimes when you're, really upset about something, it's hard to feel grateful or do the right thing, And so I'm grateful for all the things that I've learned, because I do think it's helped me navigate many of my relationships. Like, I give the example also of, I often think, and there's not really a lot of empirical work on this, but just that it's easy to take, for example, our parents for granted, right? They've always been there. And because of that, I think we can be less grateful. So my parents paid for me to go to college. I always talk about, if a stranger had done that or some extended family member had paid for me, I would have been on my knees thanking them for that. With my parents, I was kind of like, oh, yeah, you kind of like made it clear that that's what you're going to do, and I expected it from you. So it was hard to be as grateful for them. So I tried to use what I know to sort of trick my brain into not taking my relationships, with my parents or my child for granted. But it's hard. We are human and we adapt and have to remind ourselves again.
To what degree do you feel like it's luck of the draw, kind of, when you meet someone young? Because we met young too. We Moise and I, we met each other our very first day in undergrad as well.
Yeah.
How much of it do you feel like is luck of the draw, or do you feel like it's societal, like cultural, influences, or can people even know when they're picking, and they're 18 kind of thing?
Right. Well, that's the thing. I feel like you meet someone that young and maybe it's a little, I don't want to say luck of the draw, because I don't know that it's really that, but whether you end up growing together or apart, right? Like, we got lucky that we met people that we grew up, but also maybe we were motivated to grow together, and that helped us do that rather than go separate ways. So I don't, that we have yet to crack the code on how to predict chemistry and compatibility. Like, we don't know that yet. So all that the dating apps can tell you they have algorithms, there is not great evidence. Like, I have a graduate student here who's very interested in understanding compatibility, doing all this work. We're not finding that being more similar is really that beneficial. Believing you're similar is, especially if you think being similar is important, but actually being similar on all these different metrics that we're looking at has really small effects, right? So, what are these dating algorithms doing? We don't know, but relationships researchers wouldn't know really like what to put into those well, right? To like, we can predict a little bit, but not robustly, because a lot of it is what is the shared experiences you end up having together that sort of shape your relationship, right? So who you are coming into it seems to matter less than sort of who you become once you're in that relationship with that person.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's like the idea of who you are with that other person matters almost more than who you were before in some ways.
Yeah, and what you go through together. And it's true, because if you think about your own relationships, you might be a slightly different side of yourself with some people than others. And so perhaps what that person brings out in you, how you guys end up working together. And a lot of it, though, is just the experiences you end up having, the stressors that you go through, or the good experiences, and how well you navigate those, right? What you each bring into that. So it's hard to just say, like, you guys worked because of this and that other couple didn't because of this, because we can't really robustly predict. And so that, there's part of it that's just intangible, that's hard to capture. So there are people who are trying to figure out how to measure like chemistry, because there really is something. They do these cool speed dating studies where they bring people in and actually put them in speed dates.
No kidding.
And so then they can look at like who I am with everybody. Like, does everybody like me? Do I like everybody? or is there unique connections between two people, right? And that's sort of the chemistry that they find is these unique relationships that it's not me with everybody else or me towards everybody else. It's me with this particular person. But what that is, right, is that thing that's a little bit hard to capture in words.
So it's got to be endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, it is. So, but
Hmm.
there's some evidence of being more similar in like values and beliefs and sort of life orientation perhaps is helpful. It's still early days in that research, but it's believing you're on the same page that matters.
It's almost like quantum physics, where if you measure it, you change
Mhm.
it. How much
Yeah.
of that do you feel like happens in your research and like?
100%. I mean, it's something that I've talked about. Right. So often one of the methods that I love to use is what we call a daily diary method. So you ask people the same questions every day for a week or two, and you kind of get an insight into their daily lives, right? And one of the cool things is you can look not just at, if I'm more grateful than you and I'm happier, but also when you do these daily diary methods, you can say, on days when I feel more grateful, is my relationship different than on days when I feel less grateful? So looking within the same person at sort of those fluctuations, right? But once you start asking people every day to report on their gratitude, like what we're intervening in some ways, right? And so that is a struggle that we have, that our methods for collecting data are also in many ways interventions, especially if we're asking people to reflect on their relationships. I started adding into studies several years ago was at the very end saying, did participating in the study change your relationship in any way? So sometimes people would say, I started looking for good things that my partner did so I'd have something to report on that night. So we did make them more aware of it. But how do you compare that? I mean, I guess we could have a group in which we do everything except ask them about gratitude and see if we get different effects. But if you want to know about gratitude, you have to ask about it, right? Or have them have a conversation in which they express gratitude. So it's very hard that we have this problem that by measuring, we're also interfering.
Right. I just was thinking of these studies, like how meticulous you would have to be as a researcher to craft this and then implement and then have ideas and theories. I mean, it's got to be, some of these designs are extremely complex. And so what are you currently working on? What are the things, the questions you're looking at?
I have lots of them. So I have a problem of riches right now, that there's too many good things going on in my lab. So we're studying stress in couples. So a lot of the research has looked at when one partner is stressed, how the other partner supports them. And a good friend who I went to grad school with and I were talking about, we're like, that's not real life. Real life is like you're both stressed and you're both trying to just like make it through. And somehow you have to give support at the same time that you need support. And so how do people navigate that? So we've actually run a study with a couple hundred couples that came into the lab and did a task to induce stress in one or both partners. And then we're tracking them over time with our diary method. And then over the course of a year, we'll check back in with them and sort of see both in the lab and in daily life how they do it. And we do actually have them have a gratitude conversation at the end of the lab session because we're interested in whether stress and sort of focusing on that spills over and affects your ability to capitalize on a good moment with your partner, and whether you're less likely to notice the good things or be as appreciative if you're more sort of got other stuff going on that's distracting you. So that's one project. Another one, we had couples take home kids' babies, like they give them in high school, and care for them over a weekend. They came into the lab, and again, they take care of the infant, they talk about problems in their relationships, then they express gratitude to each other, take the baby home for a weekend, we track them, collect all kinds of things, including saliva to look at their stress response. Half of them, the baby wakes up, half it doesn't. Then they come back into the lab and do the same thing again. So also curious about how sort of sleep deprivation, transition to parenthood, how does that affect our ability to navigate both negative situations, but also, again, capitalize on a positive moment, like expressing gratitude to each other, right? Like, and is that a buffer? Are the people who do that well better able to sort of go through this stressful time and deal with lack of sleep than those who do it not as well? And the last big one I'm probably forgetting some, is that we're actually building a dating app for research. So just to be able to track people over time. So generally, one of the struggles we've had is, as relationships researchers, is getting people through the whole experience of dating, right? From meeting someone through forming a relationship. Usually we capture them when they're single, or we capture them dating, or we capture them once they're in a relationship, but not continuously through that whole piece. So that's our goal, is to see if we can track people through the whole experience, the same people, and sort of see how it goes. So lots going on. And another goal I have is to look at gratitude interventions. So most of the research on gratitude in relationships is correlational. So there's some great work, and we can talk about, on gratitude and well-being more generally. For example, in adolescence, there's some good work that's been done. But when we look at it in the context of ongoing relationships, usually we're just tracking people's natural levels of gratitude. So we don't know if telling someone to be more grateful is actually a good thing or not, right? And the studies that have been run have not shown, like, hit you over the head amazing effects that, like, telling people to express gratitude and suddenly their relationship satisfaction is skyrocketing, right? And yet people who are more grateful do have significantly more satisfying relationships. So how do we induce gratitude in a way that feels natural, is sort of my question. So I want to test a bunch of different gratitude interventions and see, maybe it's not even using the word gratitude. Maybe it's like just having people compliment each other, or do something more indirect, or think about gratitude generally that would then have better effects on their relationships.
I have so many thoughts on that. I have so many ideas. Seriously, because we are, as a couple, because we're both trained coaches, and we got trained in our early 20s, mid 20s, I feel like our communication is so precise. And so, we ran a relationship coaching course. It was relationship coaching is some of the hardest stuff.
Yeah.
Like, it's not for the faint of heart. Like, there was like, when you're meeting with them one-on-one, you get them in the same room, and they almost become completely different people.
Yeah. I know. It's why it's so fascinating. It's why it's studied.
It's a thing. That was going to be my next question, is how much of your work do you feel like is, descriptive versus prescriptive, in the sense of, like, the final product of it is like, hey, this is just the state of humanity. You're welcome, humanity. Or, all right, humanity, listen up. Listen up, people. This is what we got to do.
So it's interesting. I would say most of my work is predictive, where our goal is not to just say, here's how grateful people are, but how much gratitude predicts this or that, but not yet at the point of being prescriptive, where I would go out and say, without nuance, everybody should do that.
That's what I was hoping for. I was like, tell us what to do. Like,
I know. But there is other work that, is pretty robust to suggest that inducing gratitude is good generally for well-being and possibly health. So it's interesting, because the dyadic, like the relationship experience of gratitude, I think it's good. And I do give talks, like public talks on gratitude, in which I say, be more grateful. But what I tell people is to capitalize on authentic opportunities, right? So it's not that you need to go in and say thank you when you're not feeling it, or like force yourself in a moment to come up with something that doesn't feel genuine, right? But it's about recognizing that our brains are somewhat geared to see what's wrong, and that's adaptive for keeping us alive. We need to be threat vigilant. But that in doing that, we often downplay or miss the good things, right? And so sort of retraining your brain to start looking for what's good. So not like making things that aren't there, but slowing down and paying attention to what is going on that's right. And there are tricks for that. Like, there's work showing that if we sort of mentally subtract our partner from our life, people end up feeling better. So imagining that you never met your partner, actually on average has more positive effects than thinking about the first time you met them or went on a date with them. So kind of these counterfactual thinking can help reset our brains a little bit. So I always give the example, when I hear a horrible story of someone losing a partner, or there being a car crash in my city or something, these are terrible things. Small silver lining is they can help reset us a little bit and be like, oh, like that could have been me, or like, what if that was my partner in that crash? That can help us be like, oh yes, I'm seeing this person through new eyes again a little bit because I had a moment of imagining that I lost them.
One of the things I found, I was reading a lot of these things, and I was also fascinated with how transactional a lot of it feels like. Like, oh, if you do chores and you say thank you. And in my experience, I felt like the biggest thing was I appreciate her feedback on on me. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like she's made me a better person, period.
Yeah.
How much does character trait or or how do you even get to that? You know, because I was constantly like, how do you get to that spot if you can, you know?
Yeah. So I don't know about getting to that spot, but I do think you're picking up on something important, which is we can express gratitude in different ways and we can feel grateful for different things. And so has been a lot of work on expressing gratitude. And it's a little different than what you were just talking about, but reminded me of it, which is when Sarah Alger called this putting the you in thank you, right? When we focus on and appreciate not just what someone does, but who they are, right? So it's not that you took out the trash, it's that you're thoughtful and that you notice that I'm busy and you care about me and like you're a kind and caring person. But that gratitude is like an extra level that's beneficial, especially expressing it in that way, right? Not just saying, hey, thanks for making dinner, but thanks for being such a thoughtful partner, right? That's like the extra level of gratitude that's beneficial. And actually focusing on, there's research that the benefits that you receive from the other person's actions, it's right. So like you make me a better person by what you do, right? Is more beneficial perhaps than focusing on the cost that they incur by doing sort of something for you, you know? So there's definitely some nuance to how good your sort of gratitude can be or your gratitude expressions.
Like the quality of gratitude matters.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's some really cool and interesting research. But I've long been interested in sort of being grateful for who you are versus what you do, and that gratitude for who your partner is, to me, just feels deeper and like it would buffer against more things, right? That's a hypothesis at this point.
Right. You know, I was thinking the same thing in the coaching world too. I like Snyder's Hope theory, where you separate out the the character traits from the pathways. That's so useful. And from a coaching perspective, what it enables us to do is enables us to go to a place where you very specifically look for character traits and then look for ways to optimize them, use them in work and relationships, things like this. My hunch in a lot of it, like, it's not just about the other person's character traits or strengths, but the character strengths that the other person brings out in me. Like, does that make sense?
There's something called the Michelangelo phenomenon, which is all about the fact that we sculpt our partner into their ideal self, right? Or not. And that the more that we are able to help our partners realize their best self, essentially their ideal self, the better the relationship. If we sort of minimize or, ignore things that those aspects of themselves that takes away and it is problematic. So yeah, there's a whole sort of field of theory around this idea of bringing out the best in the other person. And do we want partners who see us for who we are, or who see us as better than we are? And the data, I mean, there's sort of the two camps that argue about it, but I think like the data in the end sort of suggests we want people to see us just a little bit more than accurate, right? Like just a slightly rosier view, but accurate. But it also depends on your self-esteem. So low self-esteem people want more to be verified for negative traits. So there's some differences there in terms of your self-worth. But in general, it's like, I want you to see me accurately, but maybe, especially if I'm hiring something, like just slightly better than I see myself.
So I feel so right on. Yeah. That just feels like yes. We're a mixed race couple. She's Latinx, I'm white. How much of your research goes into that, if all, like, in looking at
Not much. So I have a graduate student who's studying interracial relationships. And this comes up a lot. So like I teach a class on close relationships, and historically most of the work has been on sort of middle class, I'm not predominantly white, heterosexual couples. And wonderfully, like newer research is samples are getting much more inclusive in terms of demographics and sexual orientation. Different people can have unique stressors that they experience, right? Or unique strengths. For example, in same gender couples, there tend to be less like of the expected gender norms around division of labor. So there's more communication because it's not just like, oh, of course, we're the man, you're going to do that. I'm the woman, I can do this. So there's more communication and often ends up with more equal division of labor than might see otherwise. But at the end of the day, what I end up telling my students is that the research suggests at our core, most of these experiences are generalizable, that they're human experiences, right? That will be wanting to be appreciated and seen and heard and wanting to communicate well and all, like those are true no matter who you are and who you're in a relationship with, right? And so everyone has their idiosyncrasies, but on average, it's not that, oh, an interracial relationship looks super different from a same-race relationship or a mixed gender versus same gender relationship. How people end up acting at the end of the day is some just sort of core human tendencies, right? And so again, there are differences. There's more facing perhaps more with cultural differences that you have to communicate about, but also more opportunities for expansion if you come from meaningfully different backgrounds, right? Then maybe you get exposed more to a different culture than you would have otherwise. And that can actually be good for relationships to have sort of that self-expansion.
Right. I would imagine that it makes relationships stronger in some ways, because a lot of what happens in like the inclusion and diversity work that's happened, I feel like it's just so useful, like even beyond inclusion and diversity, like the idea of like anti-fragility or the idea of looking at how do you even have these conversations with people and like, talking about sensitive topics or things that are like super unjust. And you're like, okay, we have structures, like internal structures, even within us that we can handle these things. I'm also fascinated by that and just wonder like, where's the state of that in relationship research, if it's happening at all?
I mean, there's definitely, there's broadly a movement towards, as there is in all of academia and research, of thinking about how do we do better in terms of the samples we collect and who we're studying and who we're talking to. And so there's a huge movement towards that. So there are, for example, like my students who are interested in, these different experiences, for example, of discrimination and how they play out in relationships and the unique experiences of people who come from same or interracial relationships. But intergroup contact work suggests, like, if you have a friend or a close other of a different race, that makes a big difference, right? So if you are in a relationship with someone of a different background, right? It could be race, it could be religion, it could be, just rural versus urban and grow, like, right? So it gets you exposed to something and it can change your view, and increase your network of who you see and interact with, so that you're just exposed to more types of people with more experiences.
Like the radar screen gets more honed in some ways, I find, because you can see things from two different perspectives. We're watching the same thing and she's like, hey, like, hello, are you not seeing this? For me, it was a whole education. Like,
what's interesting is in some ways, every relationship is an something different relationship, right? Because even if from the outside we look fairly similar, you were probably raised in different cultures that have affected the fact that you view the world differently. And perhaps it's almost more dangerous if you look the same to think that you must think the same. And then you find out, no, like your family really thought loyalty was really important. And my family thought it was more about autonomy, or, and you kind of have to figure that out as you go. But that every relationship has that miscommunication of realizing you're not seeing the world exactly the same, that you each have unique experiences that you're bringing into it.
Yeah, I would imagine that makes relationships stronger, like to have the different, like what you're speaking to a degree.
It would make sense theoretically, not necessarily what the data bear out. I mean, there's some findings, but not like, again, not a hit you over the head, two different people, that idea of opposites attract, or we grow from new experience. Like, it makes sense, but we don't necessarily see that, very different people are happier either. So
It's like the similarities have to align and the differences have to.
Yeah, there might be just something much more nuanced, and what matters might differ for each individual. We haven't quite gotten how to analyze our data to get at that. So we're still working on
Gotta be the
more
best.
nuanced perspectives. So.
Oh, it's gotta be so interesting. I feel like all of these fields are relatively new. Like even the
Yeah.
coaching field is relatively new. Positive psychology is relatively new.
Yeah.
This idea of even like relationships, being able to test, stress hormones in spit is relatively new.
Yeah.
So I mean, all of this stuff is like, hey, we're going to do like with all of this
Yeah.
now, and we're learning, and here we are. So from this, what would be your pieces of advice to young people?
Yeah. So I was thinking about that because so much of my work is not with adolescents, but like what would I say from my work? But I was also thinking about, I teach a large lecture on close relationships to college students, right? Who are fairly young. And one of the things that I try to help them see throughout the semester is that often when I ask them, like what a constructive conflict looks like, or I teach them about the benefits of gratitude or things, and they see it. They're not shocked, right? To learn that hostility and criticism are problematic, or gratitude is good. But then I'll give them like an optional assignment, like after spending an hour and a half almost talking about the benefits of gratitude and how writing gratitude letters boosts people's well-being. Then I give them an optional assignment to go write a gratitude letter. And what percent of them do you think take me up on it when I ask them at the next
1
class?
out of 4.
Yeah, so around probably 25%. I just gave them another optional assignment to take a step back and write about a conflict. And the data there are pretty compelling too, that can be beneficial. It was like 4% or something that took advantage of that one. And so we often know what we should do, but it's hard to do it, right? We know the things that make a good relationship to the extent that we know them, but sometimes it can be very hard to actually enact those behaviors. And that's why I bring in myself as an example of someone who's been studying this for 20 years and still sometimes struggles to apply these things to my own life. And so thinking about sort of small ways we can incorporate sort of good practices into our life, I think is beneficial. The other thing that I like to say when I give talks on gratitude is that if you see something, say something, which is generally in like the negative reporting on bad behavior. But on the other side, it's like, if you think it, say it for me, which is often we do have a good thought in our head about someone in our life or like something we're grateful for. And we don't share it, right? So we don't take the time to tell the friend that we're so grateful to have their friendship. And so we don't capitalize on those opportunities. This could be with close friends. It could be with strangers. Like I give an example of being in line at the airport, and there was a TSA agent who was doing such a nice job of just cracking us all up while we had to wait in this long security line. And you think in your head, like, you appreciate him for doing that, but how often do you actually bother to tell him, right? So when I got up to him, I said, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. And so I try to do that now in my life. If I have a nice thought about someone, I actually try to share it. And it's amazing how much people say, you made my day saying that. Like, thank you so much. I brought a orchid to someone at my work who'd done a lot for me. She's like, I've never had someone thank me like this before, right? And so we often underestimate the value of our own words and the difference that we can make just by expressing them.
Yeah, I think my general thought on this is gratitude in relationships is useful for people to know and understand, because I think that there's an element, there's a shift. There are shifting paradigms around. In order to get what you want, you have to like somehow like have more punishment or like somehow go more negative on things, but that might work in the short run, but then in the long run it's problematic. But gratitude seems relatively safe with some very clear guidelines on not doing it inauthentically, but other than that, it feels like a pretty safe place to go
if you really feel it and you're in a healthy situation, right? Mm-hmm. You're not grateful for someone who's abusive or something like that. But my other thing, I guess, is to recognize that we have a tendency to adapt, right? Like that's to like get used to the good things in our life. they call it hedonic adaptation. And so we have to fight against that and to recognize that we have to sort of put plans in place to keep us noticing the good rather than focus on what's wrong.
Thank you. This is great to hear. It's so good to hear your passion behind the work, and to hear where you're coming from with it. And I think it is endlessly fascinating. Some of this relationship.
There's a lot more that needs to be done, but there's a lot that already has been done as well. So that points to good things.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
And have a good one. It was great meeting you.
Yeah, you too.